Recording in progress.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lisa Versace, and I'm the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the California Preservation Foundation. For those of you who may be less familiar with us, CPF is a 501c3 nonprofit organization providing statewide leadership, advocacy, and education to ensure the protection of California's diverse cultural heritage and its historic places. Our work is made possible by the generous support of our members, donors, and sponsors. We also offer complimentary two-year memberships to students and individual memberships starting at just $50 annually. Our website, californiapreservation.org, is where you can find more information on membership, future programs, and events. Today's program is brought to you by our annual education sponsor, WJE, as well as our program sponsor, Groundwork Planning and Preservation. We're joined today by guest speaker Brandon Spencer-Hartle, Historic Resources Manager for the City of Portland, Oregon. If at any time during the program you have a question for Brandon, we encourage you to put it into the Q&A. You can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Following Brandon's brief presentation, we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. Brandon's going to be further introduced by today's moderator and program sponsor, our education co-chair, Gretchen Hilliard-Boyce. Gretchen is a historian and preservation planner with over 20 years of experience working in the public and private sectors, and is the founder of Groundwork Planning and Preservation, a cultural resources consulting practice where she provides a full range of historical and cultural resources consulting services. And with that, I will hand it over to Gretchen to get today's program underway.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to have Brandon here with us today. He and I have met several times in the last few years at professional conferences, including the National Trust Conference, and many of you may have seen him speak at last week's CPF conference. So let me just give a brief introduction and then we'll jump right in. So Brandon serves as the Historic Resources Manager for the City of Portland, Oregon, and in that role, he manages all aspects of the city's survey, inventory, and designation programs. He oversees development of historic preservation regulations and directs staff and consultants on various historic preservation projects. Brandon has served as the lead author on National Register nominations, district design guidelines, historic preservation legislation, and various research and technical guides. He holds a bachelor's degree in community development and a master's degree in historic preservation. In previous roles, Brandon directed advocacy for Oregon's statewide historic preservation nonprofit and prepared historic tax credit applications for mid-scale redevelopment projects. I think most notable here is that Brandon was born and raised in Sacramento, California, spends time vacationing and camping on Mount Lassen, hiking in the Sierras, staying out late in San Francisco, and visiting family in Ventura. Thank you, Brandon, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Gretchen. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to get my screen share set up here, so just give me 1 second to do that. Again, as Gretchen said, I'm Brandon Spencer-Hartle. I use he, him pronouns. And while I am the Historic Resources Program Manager up in the city of Portland, Oregon, I'm dialing in live today from Sacramento. And so I'm a credible CPF member here in the 916 area code. So when Gretchen and the team over at CPF asked me to do this, I was pretty excited. It's been since 2006 since I had the opportunity to present at a CPF conference or a CPF program. And so on the left, I was here at my mom's house digging around in old pictures that I'll share a few of in a minute. And I found my 2006 Sacramento CPF conference badge with the exhibitor tag. So it's been a long time since I've been here at the CPF program, and Cindy and the CPF team asked me if I could present last week down in LA, and I'm not sure how many people were there at the conference, but if you're a CPF member or you were in attendance, a great opportunity for professional development, and I hope many of you had the opportunity when you were there, or if you listened in on some of the online programming to make a new connection or to find a new avenue in preservation that could be of interest. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking a little bit about my professional journey. I think the exciting part today is that we'll have opportunity for question and answer. Feel free in the chat or later when we open it up, ask me any question you want. I can always say, no, I don't want to answer that, but I'm more than happy to talk about my career trajectory. I certainly don't have all of the answers. I've had my own trials and tribulations in the field of historic preservation, but excited to impart whatever wisdom, lessons learned, pitfalls, tips for avoiding problems that I can today. So this is where I work every day. For the last 8 years, I've served as the City of Portland's Historic Resources Manager. My office is in that new contemporary building. It surrounds a national landmark, National Register landmark building in the heart of downtown Portland. If you have any plans to visit Oregon this summer or the year ahead, feel free to give me a ring. But this is where I get to go to work every day. I'm up on the 7th floor. I've got a great window view of Mount St. Helens, which is a total perk. In my day-to-day job, I do things like this. This is a presentation to the community just before the arrival of COVID. I think this was in mid-February of 2020, if I remember correctly, where I was presenting on new regulations that would go into our zoning code to a group of people at a local library. Here's another interesting thing from the work. It's the sort of ribbon cutting piece of the job. Here I am with Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who many of you may have heard of. He's been for many, many years now the co-chair of the National Historic Preservation Caucus at the sort of unveiling of a new National Register listing for a contemporary Indigenous jazz musician. And then a lot of my work looks like this. This is what our whiteboard often looks like in my office, where we're sort of, the team is brainstorming and thinking about, okay, how do we manage a project? How do we think about working with consultants and community? Which communities have been engaged that maybe are overrepresented in the past, which communities need to be better engaged. And so many of my end of day work days look like taking a picture of something like this on the office whiteboard. Okay, so that's a little bit of an insight into what my day-to-day kind of look like. What do I actually do as a historic resources manager? Here in the city of Portland, that job is called Historic Resources Program Manager. Other city or county governments have similar employees who maybe call themselves Historic Preservation Officer, Historic Preservation Director. In some cases, it's sort of Director of the Office of Historic Preservation. Most larger cities and counties in the United States have a city staff person who's responsible for implementing what's called the Certified Local Government Program. And the Certified Local Government Program is a National Park Service sort of technical credential that local governments are offered when they commit to advancing and sort of stewarding a historic preservation program. Typically, a local government that is a certified local government will have a historic landmarks commission or historic review board. Typically, the local government will play an active role in surveying and inventorying historic sites. Oftentimes, a local government will partner with community organizations on education or advocacy. And in most cases, that certified local government is responsible for implementing local regulations and local incentives for the purpose of protecting historic places. In my role, I get to oversee a variety of historic preservation activities. Some of those are more technical, like managing the annual budget for the historic preservation program, applying for and distributing grants, managing the work of staff and consultants, overseeing community processes, both large and small, ensuring citywide compliance with state and federal laws. These would be things like Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. In Oregon, we don't have the CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, that you have here in California, but we do have a similar state law. And it's my responsibility to ensure that citywide, our staff are able to meet the obligation of those laws. Oftentimes I'll get calls from media, sometimes media that are interested in historic preservation. Maybe it's Pride, it's June, so it's Pride Month. So we might get a call from the local paper or a blogger interested in, okay, what sites are significant for LGBTQ plus history. Sometimes we'll get call from media who are skeptical or who have heard rumors or seen tangible evidence of historic preservation maybe being a conflict. And so media relations is part of the job. And then ultimately, much of the work of the historic resources manager and the historic resources team at the local level, so again, city or county, is ensuring that the right regulatory mix is present to protect historic resources, allow for them to be reused, and then review when appropriate alterations, additions, new construction, demolition in historic areas. And so that sort of basket of work falls into my work program. I have the privilege of working with great colleagues. We've got colleagues who are junior in their sort of career and development in the field of historic preservation. I have colleagues who are not necessarily trained historic preservation professionals, but who have come to historic preservation through the work of planning, city planning, or through the work of environmental planning. And then we have some very interested, great sort of director level people at the city who take historic places seriously and are genuinely curious about how do we incorporate historic places, like the sign to the left, into an evolving and changing city. And so in my role, I'm the person where the buck generally stops with historic preservation issues, but I'm surrounded, both my supervisors, my lateral colleagues, and then more junior staff for ensuring that the city of Portland has an active and responsive historic preservation program. So that's a lot of like bureaucracy. It's a lot of what I like have to do to make sure that the train stays on the rails and arrives on time. But I wanted to give you a little sample of some of the fun projects that I get the benefit of working on. And so in my role the last couple of years, some really interesting opportunities have come up to both fund and direct nominations for local landmarks and National Register sites. Most of that work the last 5 years has been for underrepresented histories. I mentioned earlier, a contemporary jazz musician's house listed in the National Register late last year. We've been working with various members of our African-American community and organizations that represent that community on a series of National Register listings for African-American historic sites. And then just last week, the National Park Service did list 2 new LGBTQ plus historic sites here in the city of Portland for their significance, both for women's sport and the emergence of a lesbian community at a softball field, and for what I understand is the first bathhouse on the National Register in our downtown area. And so we've really been trying to think creatively at the city of how do we start to turn a ship that's been pointed in the wrong direction for a long time and make sure that all histories are represented. How can the city fund that and play an active role in making sure that those National Register nominations are prioritized? We also get to lead complex survey and inventory projects. So in the last several years, we've been able to really work with a diversity of communities on surveying their historic places, getting out there and making sure that our inventory is reflective of a diversity of histories. For any of you who are interested in working at local government, there's an unlimited opportunity to survey historic places and resurvey historic places and think creatively about what histories ought to be recognized in the protection programs that cities offer. So that's a very fun part of the work. I get to commission studies on a variety of topical issues in historic preservation. So adaptive reuse of houses into multifamily housing, or how do we reuse old cobblestones? We develop district design guidelines and standards. I mentioned before amending regulations. So are we protecting buildings from demolition? If so, how? What level of alteration review are we applying? What's the temperature of the community? Where are our elected leaders at on regulating and protecting historic properties? And then I really do have the very best job because I constantly get to learn from people who have unique and professional, unique lived experiences and unique professional experiences. So regularly I get to work with consultants who know much more than I do about historic preservation. I get to hear from communities who are not my own about what's special in their places. And as a public servant, and we can talk about this later, I do get the phone calls and the emails from time to time that, how do I want to say this? Like, I'm a great place for venting. And so part of the role of being a historic resources manager is you get to hear from people who have very different perspectives and experiences. And it really is the best part of the job, even if you've got the angry voicemail on a Monday morning. So where did I get my start? This is me breaking California law in 1998 or 1999. When I was a kid, I was a classic train kid, super into sort of the gold rush era California, very interested in indigenous communities. And when I was in middle school, I caught the looting fever and spent a lot of my middle school years metal detecting and occasionally finding myself doing what I now regulate against, which is digging up old historic foundations and basements and things like that. And to this day, my only like criminal record, which I was a little worried would come up when I applied for this job, but I guess it didn't, was that I did get in a little bit of trouble when I was in middle school, and it sort of changed me on my trajectory of what my interest in historic preservation was. But this is me in downtown Sacramento when I was, I think, like 11, in a basement of a building that I should not have been digging in the basement of. So we can talk more about that later. But the rest where I kind of got my start. I was digging around a little bit. Like I said, I found my very first paycheck. Here it is. This is from 2004. This is my first historic preservation paycheck. I sort of moved on from that bottle digging and looting phase of my life to a great internship with Tremaine and Associates here in Sacramento, who were a full service cultural resources management firm. I made $8 an hour. And did get to spend the summer of 2004 and the winter of 2005 working on an active historic archaeological site in downtown Sacramento that was just a great entree into the field and a great entree into cultural resources management. So at the time I was a teenager, really opened up an opportunity to literally get my hands dirty and in a way that was a great onboarding into the field. I went to college, so I grew up in Sacramento, like I said, and I had a scholarship opportunity to go to college at Portland State University, who did not have a historic preservation program, but did have a more broad community development program. When I went up there to college in the late aughts, I and a group of other people, several of the people I still know today, started a little historic preservation club. It was our way for us to go to free conferences and get the university to pay for it. And I had a great experience there, but unfortunately I did graduate in the right in the middle of the recession in 2008. So I used that as my opportunity to go on to grad school and get a master's in historic preservation from the University of Oregon. And then right after my time at University of Oregon, we can talk about some of these lessons learned. The timing worked out great. The economy was coming back around, and I got hired by the Oregon statewide historic preservation nonprofit Restore Oregon to manage education and advocacy. And here I am, I guess the tallest person had to be in the very back. We had a Heritage Barn workshop as one of our series of events, and a really great opportunity to get around the state and to learn about Democratic city councils and Republican city councils, and preservationists who are regulators and preservationists who are people who don't believe in regulation, and spending 5 years in the early 2010s working around Oregon, doing the same kind of work that CPF does. Learning from people, sponsoring National Register nominations, developing an understanding of the trade-offs and the opportunities in historic preservation, and really finding a great opportunity to build a network of people that ultimately led me in 2016 to apply for and be selected to serve as the City of Portland's Historic Resources Manager. And here's a group of people that this is my first week on the job in 2016. My first week on the job in 2016, down in the Oregon Court of Appeals, as part of a legal case that I was able to work on through my work at the city. So I want to say a couple of lessons, and then I think we're going to open it up for the facilitated discussion. So what did I learn along the way? This is me with my mess of trains when I was a kid. I still feel like this is kind of my life today. And so a couple of things I want to just impart before we start discussion is embrace mistakes and commit to rebuilding. This has been the sort of theme of my career, the theme of the projects that we take on. Oftentimes things are not a linear and clear progression from start to finish. You're going to make mistakes, and as long as you're committed to the rebuilding process, it's worth taking the risk. I personally believe that I have the privilege of serving in the role that I have today, because over the many years I've made connections. One second. I've made connections with people who inspire me. And I think I've had a general curiosity and graciousness And I think there's something about that networking, especially in a post-COVID era, that's really critical to developing your professional pursuit. Go to events, conferences, lectures, other programs, even if you don't want to get out of bed, and even if it means having to make a commute, because those are the places where you're going to meet your future employer and, frankly, your future employees. So for those of you who are not yet a CPF member or haven't gone to a CPF event, go to a CPF event. Sometimes the topic doesn't seem like something you'd be interested in, but it might surprise you and it might be the next step in your journey. I forever and still today ask my role models to get coffee, beer, or lunch. And I always offer to pay. And generally speaking, when you're the person who is looking for mentorship and professional development, they will typically pay for you. So I think that sort of culture of informational interview, getting the opportunity to really make a connection, showing an interest in what people do is a great way to develop your skills. And to be honest, the worst thing that could happen is you might email your role model, and worst case scenarios, they don't get back to you. And so take the risk, email the people you want to get to know, and really use that as an opportunity to build out your network. And then the last thing I want to say, well, two last things. Number one, sometimes you have a full-time job, and sometimes you can get the work done in 30 hours, and that's great. But there are those weeks where the work's not done until it's done. And I'm a believer, and I think I've seen this in my colleagues and my staff, that your reputation means more than your credentials. You may have a great degree from USC, you may have worked on a variety of interesting historic preservation projects, but ultimately, at least in my world, your reputation in the field of historic preservation is really the thing that's going to get you the great job or the great opportunity. And be your authentic self, even if it's weird. Some of my favorite consultants, some of my favorite colleagues, some of my most sort of aspirational preservation leaders are the people who have a niche, and that's their sort of quirky, unique preservation self is able to really develop them along in their career. And so that's kind of what I've learned along the way. I have a variety of other things that I'm hoping we can talk about today. But at the end of the day, I think from my experience, it's building the network. It's really demonstrating the dedication to the field. And at the end of the day, making mistakes and being okay with rebuilding. So with that, I think I'll stop my screen share and we can get into the questions.
Thanks, Brandon. That's great. I thoroughly appreciate how well you kind of synthesized that for us too. I haven't even thought about that for myself, like what are the lessons learned, but it's super helpful. And I resonate with a lot of what you said. And I also feel inspired by what you said, even though I'm not new to the field. So thank you.
We can have mutual admiration. This is part of being a preservationist.
Exactly. I'm just going to jump right in because we have a couple audience questions. So Antoinette asks, what are your thoughts on cross-training for preservationists who are interested in working in planning offices for cities with AICP certification?
I think it's great. I threw that slide up there, my first job in cultural resources management. I have not worked in archaeology or cultural resources management in a direct way in a very long time. I'm pretty interested in it again. And so I think one of the opportunities of being a professional and sort of taking a longer time horizon about how you'll develop your career, I would strongly encourage people to get their feet wet, explore, look for those career opportunities that might be a good, shorter term jumping off place for the next place in your career. Look for those internships in offices that might be of interest or inspiring at the moment. But certainly as a preservationist, and this is something that I've felt the tension of in my whole career, is balancing being a specialist and being a generalist. And so every day at work, I'm trying to find this balance of, am I just a historic resources person, or am I a planner, or am I a public servant, or am I thinking about public history, or am I thinking about the pragmatism of city budgeting? And so I think as you develop your career, this sort of interesting expanding and contracting of your ability to be both an expansive generalist and a narrow specialist is something that you'll see over the story arc of the years that you're in the field.
Great, thank you. Claire asked a question that maybe we always assume maybe that people know certain things, but this is a good question, is if you can explain further the connection between the National Park Service and historic preservation.
That's a great question. I am grateful because I'm at the very end of that hierarchical government chain. And so I'll use my vantage point, but I think somebody from a state historic preservation office or the National Park Service would probably have a very different answer. From my world, we look at the National Park Service for best practice. So we might look at the Secretary of the Interior standards. We might look at the National Register bulletins. We might look at Park Service guidance about adapting buildings to climate change. And so we look at the Park Service as really having the expertise and the national vision of how do we best preserve historic places. Now, at the local government level, we don't always follow that best practice, but we do regularly start there. And so we might look to the National Park Service's Secretary standards and say, that's national best practice. But here in Portland, we've heard from our Asian American Pacific Islander community that they're really interested in exterior changes to historic buildings that are culturally specific. And so we are going to deviate from the Park Service's best practice and do something that's locally informed and locally unique. The National Park Service does manage the National Register of Historic Places. There's 100,000 listings in the National Register of Historic Places. Of those 100,000 listings, we have 725 in the city of Portland, so a pretty big number. And oftentimes at the city, we use the National Register, both the listing framework and process and the honorific designation as the basis of how we think about our most significant and most appropriate to protect historic places. And so we do have a pretty defined pipeline multiple times a year for city-sponsored National Register listings that ultimately go into the National Register and become the basis of our preservation program. And the last thing I'll say is the National Park Service does house the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit, which is one of our core financial incentives at the local level to see historic places rehabilitated. I'm the manager of our certified local government. And so the National Park Service every, I think, 5 years does request an audit of our local program to make sure that we're thinking about historic preservation in a way that's consistent with national best practice, that we are doing our job of communicating National Register nominations through the process to the Park Service, and that they can learn from us if there's any opportunity for local knowledge.
Thank you. That's a good explanation. Lindsay has a question I think is very relevant for probably a lot of folks on the call, is what type of background, education experience do you look for when you're hiring someone for a junior role?
That's a great question. I wish we could hire more often than we have been. We have a pretty small team at the City of Portland, but I think some of this advice is applicable elsewhere. So thinking about a junior role, this might be somebody who's recently out of a college degree program, or maybe who skipped college and got themselves an internship or developed some practical experience in historic preservation. Maybe somebody who's in a master's program. So that's sort of first, let's say, government job or first professional job in the field of historic preservation. This isn't always true because we live in a country that has a meritocracy that benefits people like me and it doesn't benefit everybody. But in general, we have found that the person who clearly wants the job the most is oftentimes the person who will fill the seat. And so over I think I've been doing hiring now for 14 years in the field of historic preservation, both at the nonprofit Restore Oregon and now at the city. Almost every candidate who has expressed the desire, the willingness to learn, the enthusiasm, the sort of documented track record to be the person who will most respect or most, let's say, feel the greatest amount of privilege in sitting in that seat ultimately has been the person who finds themselves in that seat. So that's not always the case. I've applied for jobs and I've had jobs before that were not my dream job, not my passion job. But I do think that the experience that I've had is when you have a candidate who really, really wants to sit in that chair, they're oftentimes the one who will get the job. And sometimes, and I've had this in my past, we've had hiring processes that there was a candidate who really stood out, the person who wanted to be there the most, but they just didn't quite have the professional experience or didn't quite have the skills developed to get the job offer. I have seen those people come back and get another similar job a year or 2 or 3 later. I'll say when I applied for the city and was selected for this job, it was my third attempt at sitting in the City of Portland Historic Preservation chair. And each time I went through an interview process and I wasn't the right person for that job, it helped me hone the trajectory of where I would take my my next application.
Yeah, I think that persistency, not everyone thinks about that it sometimes doesn't happen the first time. Like for me,
Right.
when I worked at the City of San Francisco Planning Department, I interviewed there once before, didn't get the job, but then they remembered me when another job came open a year later. So that's how I ended up getting in there. So I think that's important to point out because I don't think a lot of people think about that.
I think that's right. And I think, again, it's not like I don't want to assume that everyone knows exactly where they want their career to go. It's life, right? You change, the job changes, the world changes. But I do think when you have an interest or a curiosity in the direction, or you already know the end of the road and where you're heading, this is where those informational interviews can come in helpful. And I do them to this day. When I was at CPF last week in Los Angeles, I was going down my list of, okay, who can I buy coffee for that I need to learn from? Like, I need to learn from Ken Bernstein in City of LA. I need to learn from the Arches staff. I need to learn from a variety of people while I'm here. And the way to do that is to make the connection. And I think that as an emerging professional, certainly in my day-to-day life, every month, a couple times a month, I do have the opportunity to sit down with somebody who's just interested in picking my brain, and I do that the same. I do want to say one more thing about that. I think the important part is, I've been in some informational interviews where it felt more extractive than collaborative. So when you do sit down with somebody who is either in a job that you'd be interested in doing yourself, or maybe you think, oh, they might be hiring in the future, I really think building that relationship is important. So don't necessarily go into the informational interview seeking to mine as much information as you can and run away. You may be on the hook for a couple follow-up coffees if you have a good rapport and an interesting conversation. That may be the thing that lands you the job.
Yeah. Do you all have internships at the City of Portland, or does that play a role in how you potentially hire people?
That's a good question. We, in the past, did have a more robust intern program. We have moved into a place now where all of our positions are paid. They're paid above the minimum wage. And so we have fewer interns than we did in the past. Most of our interns that we do have come through our shop, both the sort of bigger planning unit, also the historic preservation team, are people who are in an active academic program for whom an internship is a part of their degree. And so we will have sort of academic interns who will come in from time to time. But in general, we've moved more in favor of sort of the most entry-level positions that might have a life expectancy of a year or 2 years as a way for us to have somebody come in, be compensated at a level that's appropriate for where they're at in their career, and get enough skills out of the experience that they might leverage into their next career opportunity. So the last couple of years, not as many interns. I think the historic preservation nonprofits in recent years have done a better job offering, let's say, minimum wage level internships and occasionally still the unpaid internship. But at the city, we definitely have moved away from the unpaid internship model, which means that we're a little more selective in how we can spend those resources.
Yeah. Yeah, and luckily, I think most institutions, are realizing they need to pay interns. I will just say that I had, I think, 8 different internships between undergrad and grad school because I did one every summer, and I was always paid something. It maybe wasn't a lot, but I was always paid something. I think that's really important that people, feel valued for their time. So that's just my plug. Maybe don't accept an unpaid internship, people, unless, it's like for a very specific reason.
Yeah,
and that will push
tend to
the field
agree.
forward further.
My only experiences with unpaid internships, I had 2. One experience was I wanted the opportunity to work at a private sector firm, and I offered to take an unpaid internship as a way to prove myself for a summer. And I think I was there for a month before I started getting paid. And so there are those moments where if there's somewhere you really, really want to be, like if there's a nonprofit organization, small nonprofit organization that has a staff of one, they don't have the resources to hire you, but that is where you want to be. It may make sense for you to offer the unpaid internship. But I would agree with Gretchen. If you're out there and you're looking for opportunities and you're seeing unpaid internships for private sector, certainly, but public sector jobs that are not something so uniquely significant to you, I would encourage you to not go for that opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And Lisa also points out, volunteering is an excellent way to kind of get an insider view of an organization without maybe the length of commitment as an internship or something like that. So that's always, I know I always volunteered every year at the CPF conference for like the first 6 years of my career, because you got to go for free. You got to meet everyone that walked in the door if you're like working the registration table. It was an excellent way to like have a role at a conference instead of just showing up and being all by yourself. And that to me made me very nervous when I was younger. So also just volunteering for events and things like that. It's a great way to get kind of an insider, have an insider role that makes you maybe feel a little bit more connected and comfortable. Anyway.
It's so true. Yeah, I totally agree. And the other thing I'll say really quick is, while the boards of directors can be intimidating things, and there are boards of directors at all levels of the nonprofit world, and in some cases the private world too, but there are boards of directors for smaller organizations that would welcome an emerging leader. And it might not be the National Trust for Historic Preservation, it might not be CPF, but there are plenty of organizations who are looking for their student board member or their student advisor. And there is work involved, but that is a great opportunity for you to see under the hood of an organization how decisions are made, and do so in a way that's not fully extractive, because your fellow board members are also not being paid. And so there might be an opportunity, your county historical museum or an emergent local effort that would welcome you in as an advisor or a board member for maybe a 3-year term, or even something shorter. That might be a better place to put your unpaid efforts.
Mm-hmm. I want to keep on this thread for a second, and then I promise people I will go back to the audience questions, because we were chatting a little bit before the program just about salaries and career trajectory and how to navigate that and what we maybe wish we had known early on. And I wonder if you could just share some of what you were thinking about with that, because I know when I've spoken at places before, oftentimes salary comes up as a question, and maybe people are afraid to ask that here, but I think we're both very open to talking about that. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. One thing is I'm a public employee, so I can't really hide from what I make. And so if ever you're curious, most states have pay transparency laws. If you're curious what somebody who has an interesting government job, maybe at a SHPO or county makes, you could probably find that information online. And also there's great information out there that's logged, archived from past recruitment. So if you're interested in, what would I make as a junior archaeologist at a SHPO? Or what kind of pay is offered to a private sector architectural historian? You usually can find a pretty good pay range. There's a couple things that I've learned in my career. I put my first pay stub up there on the screen earlier at $8 an hour. I definitely was the beneficiary of scholarships for my college and graduate school experiences, and so I was fortunate in that way. But I did come out of college and grad school with a not insignificant student loan, which I think probably many people on the phone call and the Zoom call today are like, oh, yeah, I know the student loan world. And for those of you who don't know, and many of you probably do, if you have certain types of public student loans and work for a nonprofit or government for 10 years, it doesn't have to be a sequential 10 years, you are eligible for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And so at the end of my graduate school experience, not having a family who could pay off my loans, I was sort of thinking about what are my options to pay this loan off, and getting the job at Restore Oregon unlocked my ability to start to accrue years of service for public service loan forgiveness. And I think it was 3 years ago now, I did meet that 10-year public service loan forgiveness number. I got a very unceremonious email saying my loan was forgiven. But for those of you who are, who know student loan debt and who are thinking about your career options, public service, nonprofit service, if you can, stay the course and do the 10 years, could be a great way for you to balance your professional development and that student loan repayment need. And so when I left grad school, just to talk about numbers here, I went to work for our statewide historic preservation organization. They made me an offer of $16 an hour. This is back in 2011. And I was early in my sort of career and didn't know how much you could negotiate on these things. But something I did there that I think might be applicable to other jobs is I didn't feel I had the skills or even the professional confidence to negotiate on salary, except for I did ask for the opportunity for a year one performance bonus. that if I could do X, Y, and Z, that at the end of year one, I could be eligible for a performance bonus. And that was a useful way for me to get into the negotiation and also building my professional resume and having clear success measurements and sort of an objective opportunity to demonstrate what I had achieved. I will say I don't want to say this. In the worker preservation, sometimes you have to leave a great organization, or sometimes you have to leave a great job because your life, your career, other things call. And so when I left Restore Oregon 8 years ago to serve as the city's historic resources manager, I knew I was even behind a great team, and I knew I was even behind this amazing job that I got to be all around the state and learn from people. But as my career evolved, public service at the local government level was really what was calling my name. And so when I left Restore Oregon for City of Portland, I think I was offered something like a $68,000 a year salary. And now 8 years in and accruing more managerial responsibilities, my salary is significantly more than that. But I will say, if you go into public service and to an extent the nonprofit world, you're not necessarily looking at huge end of year bonuses. You're not necessarily looking at surprising windfalls of salary increases. As a public service, as a public servant, my salary is pegged to the classification and pegged to years of service. And so when I took the job at the city, I knew exactly what I'd be making in 5, 8, or 10 years. And so I think that's something to think about, depending on sort of how your relationship with money and career opportunity is maybe most strongly driven. Going into the for-profit world or teaming on a consultant team has the opportunity for maybe greater financial reward. Going into the world of being a public servant comes with a level of not complete stability, but a level of stability, but also predictability about what am I going to be making in this role over the long term. And I'm likely not going to see myself have a significant increase in pay unless I leave that role and go to a different role. So there's some pros and cons there as you think about, whether you want to go the public service route or private sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is, I've worked in public and private sector, and I think in private sector, you have to really advocate for yourself more. Like, you don't just get a raise because you've been somewhere for a year, or you might have an annual review, and there's no assumption that you'll get a raise. And so I think it's important to prove yourself, by working hard, and then during your reviews, pointing out what you did and asking for compensation. And even if you don't get it one year, continuing to ask for it and earning it. You can't ask for it if you haven't worked hard, but I think that's important because not a lot of people know to do that. And also when you are starting a new job, for me, I personally moved around a lot because I was trying to work my way up more quickly. And oftentimes when you're starting a new job, that's your most lucrative point to negotiate your salary, because they want you, you want the job, you can negotiate, hopefully. Once you're in, there's less incentive, unfortunately, for companies to pay you more. So, just anytime you're starting a new job, really think carefully about how much you need and what the salary's offer is, and know that, especially for private companies, when they approve a requisition for a new position, it's not like the salary is just $60K and that's all they can do. There's usually a range. And so, they know what the hard bookends are of their range, but you don't know unless you ask for more. So
yeah, Gretchen, you're exactly right.
That's my plug.
It took me many years in my career to learn that. And I really had to be on the other side of the hiring table for it to come together. When I got hired at the City of Portland, I was just so grateful to get the job that I was like, where do I sign? Yeah. But with very few exceptions, when you are offered an opportunity in the field and you feel like if you feel like it's a position that you'll be able to succeed in, always negotiate something. And that something is probably near and dear to you. Maybe it's more vacation time, maybe it's more income, maybe it's a flex schedule. I don't know exactly what that is for everybody, but you should always negotiate something. The hiring managers expect you to negotiate. And at the city, when I'm on a hiring panel, it can be a little disappointing sometimes when a candidate doesn't ask for something. We want to see somebody who's coming into the job with a lot of confidence, but also asking for what they need. And I think too, in interviewing, just quickly, it's this is two-way street, like once you get a job offer, that's your opportunity to interview the person who's offered you the job. And so as you're new in your career, just think a little bit about that. I want to put one last plug on salary before we move on. And this is of no discredit to my work at the nonprofit Restore Oregon, but I wasn't aware of retirement planning until well into my late 20s or early 30s. And so if you have an employer who offers an employer-sponsored retirement plan, if you're in a place where you can make even a small contribution to a retirement plan, that is one of my big things now is I'm like many decades out from retirement, but I started late on that. And I would encourage everyone on the call, if you can get an employer match for a retirement plan, or maybe that's something you can negotiate in the hiring process, oftentimes there's some opportunity there and you will thank yourself years from now.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, back to our audience questions. Yolanda has an amazing project that she's working on. I think it might be best for you to connect separately, but she's working on a documentary on Nina Paul and sounds like a really interesting story. So she's asked if you two can connect. So we'll make sure that that happens, Yolanda.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Okay, Cody is asking about graduate school. So looking to apply to graduate school to get a master's in historic preservation, what are some factors you took into account when looking into certain school programs and which might be a good fit?
Yeah, great question. Typically, when I get a question like that, I would cheerlead for University of Oregon's historic preservation program, but it's dormant at the moment. It's changing its campus location, and so there's a little moment where that program is not accepting new students. That will come back in a year or so. But if you're looking at starting soon, that probably isn't the right one. I had the fortune when I was in high school of getting to know the city of Sacramento's preservation manager, who at that time was Roberta Deering, who I know this organization knows well, and made a connection with her in high school, kept that connection through college. And when the time came for me to go to grad school, I had a trusted person who I could go to and say, I'm interested in planning, I'm interested in preservation policy. Should I get a master's degree? We're in a recession. What might I do? And I think that the conversation with somebody who was in a position that I could see myself in one day as a local government preservation manager really helped me decide, yes, I should go to grad school, and here are the types of focus areas that I should prioritize. At City of Portland, we are not requiring master's degrees for any of our senior and management staff. And so we've moved away from the master's degree as being a required credential. It is oftentimes the case that people who are in senior level positions or management positions will have a master's degree, but not always. What do I want to say? We've had a variety of staff in our preservation team in recent years who have had master's degrees in historic preservation, but not always. Sometimes they're in urban planning, sometimes they're in public history. I had a great graduate school experience, but for me, and I think for probably many people on the call, you can develop the same level of skills and experiences and credentials if you use that 2-year time period strategically and wisely in your professional development. So I'm a believer in higher education. I'm a believer in using the resources you have available, but it may be that graduate school is not right for everybody, even if your end goal is the same as somebody who might go through a graduate program. So I'd find those people who you are intrigued by their professional sort of path and ask them the question.
Great. Someone's asking just a very specific question about like your budget at Portland, but I'm wondering if actually you could, I'm going to reframe this question and ask you, how many staff do you currently have on the preservation team, and what ideally would you have to be able to do the level of work that you want to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our program is different than most of the larger West Coast city programs in that we have a matrix style of management. And so I do all of our preservation policy, long-range planning, compliance with state and federal laws. But my colleagues in a variety of different departments also do the work of historic preservation within a different management structure. And so citywide, I would say probably have 7 staff who are working on historic preservation issues, but there are only 3 of us today that are all preservation all the time. And so many of our staff are urban design historic preservation reviewers. So they will review new construction projects in a design district and they'll review alterations to a landmark building. And so they're wearing multiple hats. That's a little different than other cities, oftentimes, who have dedicated historic preservation review staff, urban design review staff, because we have sort of this different matrix style of management, how we've organized the functional units of the city. We do have preservation staff who are not full-time preservation staff. Similarly, whenever we have a project that maybe is a larger historic preservation planning project, like new district design standards for a historic district, or an update to our regulations concerning demolition, we will bring in other generalist planning staff to assist in the development of those tools. And so in our team, there are a couple of us who have historic preservation master's degrees. There's a couple of us who have, sort of documented and focused historic preservation expertise. And there are others who have adjacent or related areas of expertise who will work on preservation projects as assigned. In terms of budget, we'd be happy to talk with this person more later. Generally speaking, our budget comes from the city's general fund, so general city funding, and then the funding for the review of alterations, new construction, demolition in historic areas. That comes from land use review fees, so the person who's proposing the work is paying a fee. And then on top of that, we have a regular pipeline of grant dollars coming into the city from a variety of sources to help pay for the special projects.
Yeah, and there's another question here kind of related to that, talking about the use of project contractors versus city permanent staff. And so how much do you use contractors for, like, things like context statements and stuff like that? And how much is that work done by staff? And why might it go to contractors instead of staff?
Yeah, before my time, before 2018, my sense of the records and talking to the staff who had my job before 2016, is that there was definitely a preference for in-house. Staff in-house would write a National Register nomination, or staff in-house would conduct a historic resource survey. I realized when I joined the team that we have consultants, private sector consultants, who are more expert and who are more capable of developing historic preservation work products, like individual National Register nominations, like conducting an area survey, like developing a context statement. The only exception to that is we do occasionally have the right person at the right time. And so today we have an associate planner who is responsible for our in-house development of our LGBTQ plus historic sites project. They are the right person for the moment for the job. And so we will pivot sometimes if we have someone who either has the lived experience that's totally appropriate for a piece of work, or the professional experience that is perfectly aligned with the work product. But in general, I think this, from my vantage point, the city doesn't want to compete with consultants who are out there trying to earn a living doing the work of preservation. And at the end of the day, I'm never going to write a National Register nomination that's anywhere close to as good as some of our consultants can. So I will review and edit every National Register nomination that our shop funds. Like, I'll be the city project manager. And so I can't get away with not having my fingers in each nomination, each work product. But at the end of the day, there are really talented consultants who can just frankly do a better job, and who can demonstrate success on a timeline, on a budget, and in a way that's sort of meeting or exceeding best practice better than, in my estimation, city staff could. That said, if we have an opportunity, a big grant comes in, or there's the perfect person for the job, we will do things in-house. And I think, just so people know, it's not been uncommon for us at the city to have multiple six-figure annual contracts going out that are multiple six figures. So some years we might have $100,000 of contracts that go out. Some years we might have $150,000, $200,000 of contracts that go out. I think the last year, just off the top of my head, we've probably had close to $300,000 of preservation related work that's gone out to our local consultants.
Great, thank you. Switching topics a little bit here. Jessica was at CPF conference last week. Sounds like she was at the housing summit and was one of the few people from the nonprofit housing sector. And she's curious about your experience, if any, in working with housing nonprofits collaboratively on historic preservation projects for low-income housing.
Yeah, we have been so lucky in the city of Portland to have nonprofit housing managers or housing providers who care about historic buildings, either because it makes sense for their bottom line, or, and even better, several housing providers who just like old buildings, and they liked old buildings before they got into the work of affordable housing. I think they have nightmares about the old buildings. I think that they have colleagues and sub-consultants who think that they're crazy to take on old buildings. But we are really lucky to have an industry that has a good handful of housing providers, housing developers who want to site affordable housing in and around historic buildings. And so today we have a variety of subsidized affordable housing projects that are coming online through recent public bond measures that are in National Register buildings or on the grounds of a National Register site. And so we've been really fortunate in that way. I wouldn't say all of our affordable housing developers have that same penchant for older and historic buildings. But we have firms like Innovative Housing, Central City Concern, Northwest Housing Alternatives, who in recent years have done some of our best historic rehab projects that I think would be great national models.
Great. Question here just about, could you speak more to specific conferences, courses, certifications, organizations that, basically it sounds like offering free training for people who don't necessarily want to commit to the financial burden of another master's degree, but still getting a similar level of education. Do you have
that's a good question. Probably I want to balance this. The cost of registration at the California Preservation Foundation Conference or the National Trust for Historic Preservation's annual conference or the National Council on Historic Preservation Commission's annual conference is going to be a tiny fraction of like one semester of coursework at a graduate program. And so if you're kind of weighing the options, do I go to graduate school? Do I attend more conferences? It's a pretty small investment, even though it could be a couple $100. Oftentimes you can volunteer and get a free or reduced spot at the conference. I think the thing that you won't necessarily take away from conferences and seminars, well, I love attending them, and it's always a joy to get to know people, is you won't necessarily develop the rigorous skills that come with a historic preservation program. So for example, University of Oregon's historic preservation program, they have a great instructor who teaches their National Register of Historic Places class. You will write and edit and rewrite and refine a National Register nomination before you graduate from University of Oregon's graduate program. Or another example for University of Oregon's graduate program, you will develop the rigorous understanding of predominant American styles and predominant American sort of building treatments, so that if you are hired in the future or you are hiring to conduct a historic resource survey, you will know about sort of the core aspects of how we document historic buildings. And those things aren't necessarily going to come from a day-long training. They're going to require the development of the skills with support from somebody who's experienced at that.
Yeah, takes reps sometimes just to do the work and learn the pros and cons of how you do things. Okay, a couple of comments here. Alex says, idea, working with the culture resources professor to start a survey of structures that can qualify for local designation. Think about a stipend for each student for their finished project. City needs to add it to its original survey. City is interested in an open enrollment for additions. I know other cities have done that in the past. I don't know if that's something that you currently would consider or not.
We sponsored a University of Oregon graduate class to survey a neighborhood back in 2019 or 2020. It was a great experience. With city sponsored, we had like city sponsored iPads and a city sponsored camera that sort of exceeded our architectural submission requirements. And that was a great opportunity. And so I think there are these chances for us to get out there and partner with students. I think I have seen quality control issues. So as the person who's responsible for adding anything to our local inventory, we will only add things to our local inventory when we've met those quality control standards. And so oftentimes, in my experience, student work does require additional budget for quality control. And so I think that's an area, if you're a student and you have that skill to work with your fellow students or really demonstrate that you can bring a quality product to the client. That's always very helpful. And for our inventory locally, we've talked about this for a long time. We are not at a place where we're comfortable with it being crowdsourced. We really do want to have the rigor and the review process, especially if we're applying a historic resource status to private property, and especially if that property is a property that's owned by a historically underrepresented person or community. We are very cautious about adding public crowdsource or student work to our official historic resource map because of the potential impacts on private property owners, tenants, a community for whom preservation is not necessarily their first priority. We have to thread that needle of getting it right. Sometimes we're a little too conservative. We've been in situations where we've been a little too liberal with adding properties to our inventory. And so it's just a fine balancing act.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's one more question here, and I don't know what it means. So tell me, so pros and cons of Portland's matrix format. How new is it? I don't know what the matrix is.
Oh, yeah. So what we've done, so Portland has an interesting form of government. We are overhauling our form of government this year. We do not have enough time today to get into like what that means. But what it does mean is that we've sort of decentralized our preservation function. So I do serve as the city's historic resources program manager. It all kind of flows through me. But for example, our City Historic Landmarks Commission, for whom I'm the preservation program liaison, they are staffed by someone who's not a historic preservation professional. They are somebody who is a great city planner, who has experience with design and historic reviews, but for whom has the bandwidth and the jurisdiction to be the staff person of the commission. Mm-hmm. Our transportation bureau has in-house project managers who are responsible for putting together the compliance paperwork whenever they affect a historic bridge or whenever they have a project that might unearth an inadvertent discovery of an archaeological resource. And so what we have is less of a centralized preservation program than some of the larger West Coast cities, LA, San Francisco may have. But it does mean there are preservationists by their work assignments, not necessarily by their training, existing throughout the city's sort of organizational structure, reporting to different managers and then liaising with me and with others as appropriate.
Thank you. I wasn't sure what they were referencing, so thank you. I know we're just out of time, but I just want to answer this one last question from Riley, saying, getting both of your degrees in the state of Oregon, would you consider this an obstacle when applying for out-of-state jobs? Or historic preservation degrees applicable out of state?
That's a good question. I don't think that the degree program, well, let me say two things. One, the degree program is a great opportunity to build a professional network. California has very few historic preservation programs. And so I do, over the years, many University of Oregon graduates have come down here to work in city and county planning offices, to work in the SHPO office, to do the work of consultants. And so I would be a little less concerned about your academic experience being somewhere else if your ultimate goal is to find yourself back here in the state of California. California has a unique set of regulations that are less translatable to other places. And so if you anticipate doing work related to CEQA or California Environmental Quality Act, you're not necessarily going to learn about that in the graduate program elsewhere. And you're certainly not going to learn about it in work at a city planning office or as a consultant if you're out of state. And so there are some things to think about. I believe that you can get trained up on CEQA in pretty quick time. I know multiple universities offer sort of crash courses on CEQA implementation. I think UC Davis offers a variety of courses. I think they're online now, where if you, let's say, go to school out of state or you recently moved back to California and your experience is somewhere else, there are opportunities for you to develop enough CEQA expertise that you can find yourself in a job that would further that professional development. Gretchen, you may have some thoughts about that too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that. Yeah, and I went to school in the East Coast and then have done almost my whole career on the West Coast. So there's definitely a learning curve, but it doesn't mean you can't learn it on the job. It's just there is, especially in California, we do things in a very specific way here that you're probably not going to learn about in an out-of-state program. So just something to be aware of, I think.
And I think the nice thing about the programs, as I'll say, is programs and also entry-level positions. If you're getting familiar with and developing expertise in historic resource survey, historic resource documentation, evaluating eligibility, understanding the regulatory environment that the local government applies, getting to know the secretary standards, it's a much easier bridge to apply that knowledge and those experiences to CEQA if you take a seminar or you take a training. I've taken them before just to keep up on what's going on the West Coast. it could be a really good way for you to just know it's an easy translate of those experiences into how you'll operate in the state of California.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for this. I feel like I could talk to you all day and pick your brain about all these things, but thank you for offering such, open and inspiring dialogue. And Lisa, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, I agree, Brandon. I think that your whole talk was very inspirational. You shared a lot of really great insights. And I especially appreciate that you shared your sometimes less than law-abiding professional journey with us.
It's going to be on YouTube forever now. Statute of limitations.
They're going to come find you now. On behalf of myself and the staff here at CPF, Gretchen, and our other education co-chair, Antonio, I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. We really hope you enjoyed this program. We encourage you to leave feedback or suggest future topics for our programs using the survey that you're going to be redirected to upon closing your Zoom window. Very shortly, we'll be announcing the next program in our mentorship series, which will be scheduled for August. In the meantime, we hope that you consider joining CPF as a member if you are not already one. Thank you again, Brandon, so much, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon. Thank you so much.